Hopefully, finally it will work. Yeah, the goal. That. Oh,
An hour late. How about that?
come let's start.
So what should we do? Like we're really late. This could just run in the background, and then we could just have our conversation.
Yeah.
Then you can see. I mean, basically, you heard a bit of that. Okay? I can just introduce the things. It's. I started in the 70s as you know.
So go to the mic. Take mic.
Yeah. So I've started the. You're doing not happening right now. You do it. I think that's what you're doing. So, yeah. I don't know how much the first film said, but it had.
Sunil, mic is not working. Take this one. Take this one. This one.
Is this one working? Oh,
Yes.
So briefly, I'll tell a different story, then there'll be the visual one. Okay. I was born and brought up in Delhi in the 50s and 60s. And where quite a lot of sex happened, as I can remember, but there was zero discussion of it by anyone. But it didn't seem that complicated to find it. So basically, I had this happy-go-lucky childhood. I knew where to find guys if I wanted them from about 6 years old. And I knew that I'm wise to keep my mouth shut about it. I did this kind of weird thing. Then at 15, suddenly we arrived in Canada. It's a whole new world for me suddenly. Similar opportunities and ways of working did not exist. In fact, I arrived there rather naively because no one discussed Canada with me. I hadn't thought of Canada. I was just told we're going, and I think the Canadians gave my parents some brochure or 12-page thing about Canada. And I glanced at that, and there was nothing about homosexuals, obviously. So I did my Delhi experience. Although Delhi is relatively, even then, was because it's got embassies, got a little bit of multiculturalism. But essentially, my sex life consisted of other Indian boys. I never figured white or black or other kinds of people in my horizon. So for the first year almost, I was in a high school thinking, oh my goodness, there's all these white people and they're all heterosexual. What's going to happen now? So then finally I met somebody who I thought was Indian. I thought the Indian boys will do it. So we turned out to be Italian actually. And so I was very fortunate. The year I arrived in Canada was 69. Okay, so maybe you can do that because I'm just giving you a talk quickly and then another.
Yeah.
So the highlight was 69, we arrived in September. It coincided with Stonewall shortly after. I never heard of anything like it, obviously, but it happened. But the impact on me was huge. So by 1970, I went to college and people were coming out suddenly. And there was this idea that you come out. There was something called gay, and then I realized that this kind of fun I was having had a name, and then you were supposed to come out. And I decided that nobody knew what India meant or where I'd come from. And it wasn't very cool, so my classmates had no idea where I'd come from. Whereas being gay seemed a lot more cool. And so I latched on to that as a more useful, more fashionable identity.
Change the angle because it is quite
And kind of,
it is not focusing.
we're back. So then got involved with the gay student movement like you are. And then we had a newspaper, a lot of meetings, etc. And the beginnings of our version of gay liberation. So I joined that. And ever since then, I've been very involved in documenting that kind of politics of coming out. I decided to practice it immediately. So at 17, I came home and said to my Indian parents that I was gay, and now they had a problem. And so it was a bit odd because they thought my being gay was my problem. So they were trying to help me. I was saying, no, 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 I don't have a problem. You have a problem. I have to help you. So it would cross purposes. And because I was in university, I was coming home with a reading list. Lots of books were coming out. I made them a reading list. I said, you read all these books and you'll figure out something. And then we decided not to talk about it again, ever. Although my father was quite pragmatic, more than I expected of him. He was a military guy, ex-military. So we discussed the idea that this is a problem for me, which it wasn't. Then he said it's a phase, which I didn't think it was a phase, which said it might be a phase. And then he said, if I want to see a shrink, that's something he never mentioned before. I didn't know he knew that shrinks exist in the first place. Because his idea of living was, if things don't go your way, you get a stick and you beat the hell out of somebody. That sorts it out. So, he comes from a UP landed gentry kind of violent background, I'd say. Anyway, so we had this discussion, but then actually he was nice. The last thing he said was, you're an Indian boy, the thing you need to do is get married and have children, preferably boys. Carry on the line, who's going to inherit everything. And rest of it, I don't care. Really didn't care who I slept with. And he said, people don't really care. And in India, people don't care. You just have to talk about it. It's a little discreet, and nobody cares. He'd done this all his life. He could keep his fingers off anybody, female in his case. So, and we had to live with this. My mother had to live with this, and my father was quite indiscreetly trying to finger everybody who came by within his reach. So, anyway, so the work became that, and then in the 80s, in the 70s, I moved to New York. I met somebody in school, moved to New York, moved to London, kind of thing. And the photography played a bigger and bigger part. And so the point I wanted to make in this quick intro is that for most of my life, I've been a kind of immigrant, and the immigrant experience is often described as a departure. And so everybody sitting in London and New York, I think, and thinking about back home, but there's Chennai or Delhi or whatever, and there's this great, the diaspora is like out there thinking about homeland, and there's a kind of nostalgia, and all that goes with it. I don't tell you, you probably figured how that works. But I've come to realize that in my case, migration wasn't a departure so much as an arrival. So I left behind an Indian identity, but I arrived into a gay one. And in 1969, if I hadn't done that, I would be living in Delhi, married with children, but having sex on the side, like many of my peers at the time. So in my day, it was all like gay liberation. Then it became lesbian and gay liberation. There were some interesting gender variations. In the UK, we always said lesbian and gay in the 80s. Put the ladies first. The Americans always said gay and lesbian, put the men first. And they and like that. And so, so basically, a lot of sort of work like this happened, workshops and chats and discussions. And I guess one of the principles of the coming out moment is that if you unburden yourself, whether it's your parents or your classmates or more publicly, it kind of takes the weight off your shoulders. It does kind of become other people's problem. It becomes society's problem, not yours personally. So that's really been my experience. So I'd like to usher us into the mental health discussion. The worst thing you can do is to sit in your rooms and feel like I'm the only one.
So thank you, Sunil, for this great introduction, because I think there are a couple of things that emerged that I think will be relevant for this audience, because I think they're young people, queer or allies, and I think a lot of them are from the social sciences, some are from engineering. So there's a mixed crowd here, I'm assuming. So one of the things that you mentioned was how people get trapped in their identities. You know, that's a very important discussion because people here, all of us also inhabit multiple identities. You know, children, aspiring bankers, aspiring engineers, um, Indians, Indian culture, and you spoke about how a lot of time these identities clash in a sense, right? As a queer person, do you inhabit your queer identity first? And now with the reading down 377, there's been a lot of discussion. There's gay marriage, queer marriage, same-sex marriage on the cards. Um, what is your advice to young people? I mean, you were saying quite clearly that I inhabited the gay identity first, and that became everybody else's problem. I freed myself first. So, what would you say to young people?
Uh, well, yes, I think my experience was by taking on the identity full on and confronting people with it. Uh, it made me like much more self-confident about it and unafraid. You know, I think fear is one of the things. Now, because of my India and versus the West experience, if I can make a vast generalization in terms of mental health, in India it seems to be about shame. In the West it's about guilt. So the whole Western way of looking at it is Freudian and it's about guilt. And
So, I mean, I'm also asking a follow-up question here because a lot of these are young people, and when we were queer and young, we came out early, but we know of enough people who struggled with their identity and the damage it did to them permanently, mentally and emotionally. You know, the inability to build good relationships, and the first thing being that your own relationship with yourself is a little damaged by that time. How does one preserve one's mental health in this situation? Because, I mean, you spoke very eloquently about the Indian situation, but you also know the Indian situation very well. And in many cases, not much has changed, right, for young queer people. They are still fighting the same battles at home, in institutions. Um, Not everywhere is welcoming even after the law change. So,
yeah, and they're still turning on this pivotal thing of having to keep it hidden. This having to keep it hidden in different ways brings a lot of pressure, and then obviously the flip side is there's this possibility of exposure, which will bring tremendous shame not only to you but to other people in your family around you and so on. I mean, I had gay friends who got married because to make their mother happy. I'm not joking, that's really why they got married. They got married because if they didn't get married, their younger sibling couldn't get married. So it does affect other people in this country. It's not just you. And of course, we live in a system which is very tribal and familiar. It's not easy to come out and separate yourself. Try and explain this to Western audiences. They find it hard to get their head around it. But in the West, when you come out into a queer culture, there's other people like you out. So similar young people like you might have paid a penalty to come out by having a big row with their families, having to then support themselves somehow. But they would find other people in a similar situation. You kind of come out into a context. I'm feeling in India, there's not that same context to come out in.
I mean, I would not make this conversation like a sad one because I think we all have faced questions of coming out and when you want to come out, and you know, there's not just one closet that you come out of. You come out as queer, then sometimes you come out as something else. It's like a lifetime learning course, I'm sure the IITMs are better at it than I was because they do better at learning. But I want to ask this question: what's the fun part of coming out? What is the good part about coming out? Because in India we are so fearful, stigma, pressure, shaming, abandonment, family will throw out, conversion therapy. That sometimes I actually don't know what to tell young people. What's the fun part of coming out? I'm asking you because you came out in the 50s and 60s, kind of, right?
Well, number one, you have lots of sex. But you are.
You can have lots of sex
That's the
without
fun part
coming
of
out.
it.
That's not true.
But the other part is, so in my case, in my history, the 80s brought AIDS, and that was very scary. And then that became a double whammy. So if you were fearful and invisibilized and kind of in the closet about things, it was hard to access information. So again, where I was in the West, it was a gay disease, and the people who initially came forward to oppose very conservative government policies and to challenge the medical establishment were gay male activists, and there were people like Agtop and so on. In this country in 1988, I made a work about that. I don't think it's here. It was quotations from our Indian health minister in 88 who said all kinds of very weird, would be funny if it wasn't so serious things about AIDS. He said, "You show me somebody with AIDS, I'll put him in prison." That was the Indians, or Indians don't get it. That's what the Americans get. They were like really bizarre attitudes coming from the Ministry of Health, which was very strange. Don't deny it.
No, I remember this because a very well-known activist called Ashok Kavi who went to meet the HIV heads programs. And this will be very much of interest to young queer people. And he said to them that you have not covered queer people, gay people in this. And the head of the program said, but there are no gay people in India. So he said, no, I am one. He said, then you must be the only one. Because there are no other. And he said, what about lesbians? He said, no, there are no lesbians in India. There'll never be. Women don't have this thing. Only some men have it, and that also in the West. But I mean, it's also instructive because we've come quite far having that discussion.
Yeah, except, so in the 80s, when I made some gay work in Delhi, I used to have conversations which I recorded on audio tape with gay men that I was encountering in cruising situations who were anonymous, so I felt, so I reckon they were freer to talk. And I was trying to find out what they thought it meant to be gay. And often it didn't coincide with my view of what it meant to be gay. For me, it was very political in the sense that you came out and announced yourself and you took the consequences, whether it was a break with the family, a loss of a job, or whatever. But just to get married and carry on and just have a bit of sex with some guys on the side, I didn't feel that was really gay. So in that sense, India didn't have those kind of gay people, maybe. And one consequence of that is age, of course, because the whole gay business globally has been earlier generations who were pretty quiet about it. It's not like they weren't there, both in India and abroad. There's a very interesting history book on New York, called Gay New York, which is a century of gay people before history, who nobody wants to discuss because they weren't out and proud. But then my generation did this whole out and proud business, and now we're all confronting like it's maturity and become senior citizens and older age, and so a whole lot of new issues have come. So I said a little bit jokingly that when I was young and you were gay and having lots of sex, and then when you're older, being gay means where are you going to end up?
Yeah.
So the question is sort of changed, and yeah.
I mean, that is also a concern. I mean, I see a lot of your work reflects your relationships, and there is a very sort of public position you take on kind of loving and longing, and that has also informed your work, right? And now I see that also very often queer people ask me, where do I land up? I became queer now, I have identified as such and such identity, and in the Indian context, where am I going to land up? And often I say to them that you land up on your own 2 feet, because nowhere in the West also are relationships permanent. They are long term maybe. And in India we might be building those. And there have been previously in the past. It's not that, yeah. So I mean, it's just that we don't know that history. So what do you think about that? I mean, when young people feel this insecurity about relationships and about loving and longing and wanting that.
I think a lot of people are discovering, younger people and older people, and definitely middle-aged people, that it's now like, especially with the apps, it's like super easy to get laid, whatever you want. It seems to be much harder to find a relationship or a romantic love in a way. Uh, so in between all the sex, I was sort of championing romantic love. So I met my first guy at 20 in college like this. Met with a guy sitting next to you, and then we put together for 10 whole years, which I was not expecting. Similarly, I had 3 weeks off, and then the next guy arrived, and then we were together for 11 years. So I'm kind of serial monogamous, maybe, with some bits on the side. And then there was a whole period of singlehood, which I wasn't prepared for. So that was quite tough. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not easy, so you wouldn't necessarily choose to be gay, because it's really hard road to follow, and especially in this context here.
Yeah.
So I think first we all must appreciate how difficult it is for everybody, out or not out, whatever, that they are being tested at every stage. And but on the other hand, they're entitled to live their lives and to find love.
And I mean, and that's basic human need, right? I mean, you come out as queer in this culture, but you also want to be loved and appreciated for who you are. I mean, it's a basic human need. Even the most self-contained person wants it. And that also brings us to this discussion on same-sex marriage, which is playing out in India right now in such a big way. Retired judges are writing against it, and people are saying our culture will vanish if 2 men or 2 women get married. And that although India has a very rich history of same-sex long-term relationships. But I want to momentarily turn to this piece of work, which I think is Mr. Malhotra's party, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this, because this was the early work done out of documenting queer people in India, kind of, at that time. I don't think there was anything like that. Why did you embark on this work, and what was it about? If you could tell the audience a little bit.
So this work was made between 2007 and 12, and they're portraits of young queer people in Delhi. And I've shot them outside, and I've shot them near where they either live or work. And it's a kind of contrast to an earlier series from the 80s, also in Delhi, which was trying to also visualize, in that case, only gay men. I didn't come across women who were willing to be photographed. And the story from the 80s was very different. So nobody wanted to be in front of the camera, nobody wanted to show their face, and so on. And again, we were outside. So what was interesting in the 80s, that the outside became a kind of community center. So basically, the bits of the park or the bits behind a certain tomb that you might go to have sex became physical community spaces. So if you went there regularly, you would encounter a similar cast of people. You recognize people, conversations would start, people would warn you what the topic is. There was a recognition. So I felt that there was a certain solidarity building happening, that community building through this act of cruising in the public space. It wasn't all like doom and gloom in person. But of course, they weren't prepared to show themselves. Now, of course, everything has changed. It's not just gay men. It's not even gay anymore. It's become queer, and genders become fluid. So the people in my pictures are now born biologically male or female. It didn't seem to matter so much. And what's also changed is that this whole generation seems to be more out publicly and not willing to be photographed in a full view and to give their names. So we put the names under the pictures and to be very out. And this was a surprise to me a bit. I didn't think India would change that fast in my lifetime. This tendency to think about India, oh, it's 5,000 years old, nothing's going to change. Almost like this. But this part of society or this part of life has dramatically changed in my lifetime. I remember being in a courthouse in the first judgment, and we weren't sure if they would approve it, and then they did. It was quite amazing. And the fact that we're now at this sort of marriage point, and I met some people in Delhi who have filed yet another petition to go beyond just marriage between two people. They want the courts to recognize unions between more than two people, unions which need not be sexual. So like 3 or 4 of us could get together and form a legal union.
Like a civil union.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned this because I also remember, a lot of people think in the 80s or 90s or 2000s there was not much happening. But actually there was a whole gay culture, and also to some extent a lesbian culture. And they were like family to each other because there was no support from families on these issues, and there was no support often. Certainly no support from the state. You were a criminal to the state. So even in the cruising parks, you formed the most interesting and fascinating friendships that endured over years. And that is also part of living in almost a subterranean way. So that because there were no apps, there was no internet, there was no Grindr, there was no Tinder. So you met a person in the park. Sometimes you didn't have sex with them or anything, but they became your friends over time. You saw them every week, and a close bond would form. And I think some of the work that you did around Delhi earlier sort of refers to those relationships, doesn't it?
Yeah, because these people were also very crucial as informants also. So I'm creating a kind of boundary to the community. So as a group of people, we would know certain kinds of things, and all we had was maybe a phone number, perhaps. So communications weren't necessarily very easy. And what was interesting then is that the classes were more mixed because of being outside. So, for example, Nehru Park in Delhi was a famous cruising joint, and I don't know if Nehru Park here is the same. There's a Nehru Park here. I discovered yesterday. So you go there and you could be chatting with anybody, some wealthy South Delhi person, or somebody's driver, or somebody, a working class person. There was a great un-Indian-like mixture of people around. I find now with the apps and it's menu-driven, it's created a big separation socially in that caste and class kind of way. So I don't know about here, but in Delhi, and if you know Delhi, it's like super stratified.
But it's the same in Bangalore, the same in Chennai, the same in Hyderabad. This stratification, which has come with liberation and with money, is everywhere. With exposure also. I mean, it's a good thing that we have access to all of that, but it also has its sort of counterfactual, you know. It has consequences. I want to open up the discussion a little bit. Please, if any of you have questions, because I have a ton of questions for Sunil, but I'm not going to keep asking them. Any of you have questions, if you've seen his work, or if there are any issues, queer issues that you want to ask him about, please feel free. This was intended as a free-flowing discussion. Nobody? Okay. Clearly we are not engaging
there is a
in.
question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, sir. So, I was just going to ask about your work, be it textiles or W. Malhotra's party. The concept is very simple but very powerful. Like, every image kind of makes a statement that we are also here. Just, you're not invisible anymore. So I just wanted to ask you how you came to that concept. Like, were you inspired by someone, or like, what was the thought process?
Oh, it was triggered, the title was triggered by a gay club that happened in Delhi. It was called Pegs and Pints. And the way it signposted a gay night was by having a fictitious name party. And that's where I saw it one night. So there were different names. And this name stood out for me. My neighbors were called Malhotra in the 50s. And Malhotra was a very typical, hardworking Punjabi refugee from Pakistan, at least in my mind. Not very bright, but very hardworking. And these are the people who kind of made Delhi. And we don't appreciate them, we think we're better than them most of the time. Anyway, so that gave me the title. And then at the same time, I had moved to India to live in 2005, and I got adopted by a gay group, a queer group from JNU in Delhi, people like you, who thought I should join them, and I said, but I'm older than your parents. And they said, that wouldn't matter. But they were using culture to raise awareness, so they would have programs like this at JNU once a month. Show a video or something to start a discussion, and then the reason they wanted me was that not for JNU, but they wanted to move it out off campus and then host these events in the city and to have an impact on the general public. And then through that, we ended up having a festival, a public festival, which had film screenings and poetry readings and theater readings and a photography show, obviously, because I was involved. And like that, and it became a very interesting situation because it's very hard to find our queer history in this subcontinent because it's also very well hidden. It's also very well destroyed. So very gay people who had left us anything, I personally have heard of gay men who are not out, who have photographic archives of boys that they liked or knew in their lifetime. When they die and their families find these pictures, they just burn them. So it's very hard for us to have a history. And so, but I feel it's important that we need a visual culture to reference us. And so when we did this festival, for example, we would put out a call, like please send us your videos or your photos. And so photos we got, but videos were very few, so they mostly all came from the US. So we were in danger of having a kind of Western film festival in Delhi. But then slowly people began to respond to some filmmakers locally, made some shorts. We had a policy with the photography that it wasn't about how brilliant the pictures were, it was enough that it was about regular gay, ordinary people. in the pictures and taken by them. And so there would maybe be 80 in a show or something. This went on for 4 or 5 years. And so that process alone has now left us officially a photo archive that I'm very proud of 500 photos that describe it's kind of Indian work came from all over. That exists. Because it exists, you can study it, you can do your PhD on it. It can, it's got the potential.
I mean, I do want to clarify though why it was called Mr. Malhotra's party. Can you guys guess? No? So in Delhi and in parts of India, you can't really have a paid party. You know that? The police can bust you. So the bar would say, we are inviting all these gay and lesbian people, they are paying 300 or 350 or 500 rupees, but we don't want to get caught. So they used to post this big banner outside saying Mr. Malhotra's party, Mr. Gupta's party, very rarely Mr. Gupta, I don't think Gupta's don't drink and party, but Mr. whatever party. I mean, obviously not an obvious but slightly obvious North Indian Punjabi name. Reason being that the police comes, they will say, no, it is Mr. Malhotra's party. But of course, there is no Mr. Malhotra. God knows if there was a Malhotra inside also or not. But it was a very good cover. And I remember, Modi. Sure. But also very interesting because this is how queer life exists. And it exists in participation sometimes with street people and their bars. And because we give them money, they decide to do this and call it Mr. Malhotra's party or Mr. Grover's party. It's very interesting because also it was a safe space for a lot of women to come until straight men started arriving there to harass the women. Until then, it was a safe space for women also. Especially in a lot of my straight female friends would insist they want to come. And the reason was very simple. They'd say, nobody is going to attack us, nobody is going to touch us inappropriately, nobody is going to pass a lewd comment. What can be a safer space? We can drink, we can dance, we can yell our lungs out, and then we can get into the car and go. There is no such space that is available to us. It's also interesting because this is how queer spaces also become safe spaces for women. Right.
So, while we're on the topic of bars and going out and all of that, I just try to link it to what has become a very major issue, queer issue, gay issue, anyway. So, you go to this bar and you drink, and so drinking and alcoholism became a very huge problem in our gay men. And then the next step was drug taking. And this has swept gay life across the world. And so we're talking about mental health. So some people do this to as a response to the pain or whatever.
Coping, really. It's a
Yeah,
coping
kind of
mechanism.
coping mechanism, which leads inevitably to even bigger problems.
I mean, this is the, yeah, sorry, please go ahead. No.
So along your introduction, when you said, race was not initially, something that was on your radar, it made a sense to me because I recently watched this documentary called All That Beauty and Bloodshed on Nan Goldin. Yeah. And, it's so interesting because as a Indian, when you're watching something that has happened in, a couple of decades earlier in a different country, the response I had to her pictures when I saw them on screen. It's just you are infuriated on their behalf, and you are interested in what the scene was like in New York, what the gay culture looked like, and what happened with the AIDS thing, and all of that. But seeing your photos, right, and the same way, like you're documenting queer people, literally, and I don't know about the aesthetic specifics, but just in terms of documenting identity, people you come across, relationships, partners, and all. But when I see brown bodies on screen, Indians on screen, I'm here to figure out the response I'm having to these pictures isn't similar in the sense that when you see an Indian queer person on screen, I don't know, it's not simple because I myself am Indian and I know the context of this country better. It's not like emancipatory politics or freedom or identity. Those are not the things you're thinking. You're wondering how is this person dealing with this? Right? How are they living in this country? It's a lot more complicated and not just you don't see it and feel. I don't know. It feels a lot more like race and having living in this country with this identity. And I'm still figuring it out. But it was very interesting to see different sets of bodies on screen. Just wanted to say.
Well, thank you. This has been one of my main motivating factors to make all of these pictures was when I grew up and through my art education, I left art school after 5 years. They had a fancy MA from a very fancy university, the Royal College of Art. There was no gay Indians to be seen in art history anywhere, not in the West and not over here. So the West are maybe not interested in stuff beyond Greece in terms of art history, and the Indians are very good at hiding anything that they might have had. I mean, I just had a discussion today about maybe having a show in Chennai, and one of the aspects that came up was how can we show my pictures that feature nudity? I was saying brown bodies, what about naked brown bodies? And then you think, we're a country that produced Khajuraho and things. How come they're suddenly being so prudish? Where did that come from?
And that kind of continues because, to take your point a little bit further about brown bodies, when you see, when you see on the West, the images that you see that are brown, naked, and queer are Latino images, or they are black images. But there are very few, and there's a systematic erasure. For instance, if you see in Lahore, there is a very famous saint called Shah Hussain, and I always refer to this because it's work done by our dear friend Sunil Gupta. All of Lahore, it's one of the biggest cities in Asia, goes to that shrine. Buried next to him is his companion, who is a Hindu boy who he lived with all his life. Now, if you say to someone in Lahore that Shah Hussain was homosexual, you will be murdered. But all of Shah Hussein's poetry refers to how much he is in love with Madhavlal, who is his, in fact, he says, don't call me Shah Hussain, call me Madhavlal Hussain. That's one of his kafiyas. So there's this systematic erasure that goes on, which also sort of brings us to this work that you created, which I remember from Paris, and which, by the way, had to be taken down in Delhi because somebody complained against it, because it had naked brown bodies in an art gallery. So tell us a little bit about this, because I think they will also be interested not just in the work but also why it was taken down.
Okay, so the work was originated as a commission from the Pompidou Center in Paris, and it's a narrative, it's a fictional narrative, and it's based on a very well-known French film called La Jetée, which is made up of stills, not animation, it's still after still after still. And it was post-apocalyptic, and the survivors live underground. So what I did was, and then the main character in that film is sent on time travel. They have a rudimentary time machine, and he keeps meeting this woman, the same woman every time he goes, and they fall in love, but he can't control when he's there, where he'll be next. And so I just turned the story around a bit, and so in my case, the apocalyptic event was AIDS, and the main character became this very straight-appearing Indian guy, and instead of living in the tunnels, he was living in a bathhouse. Anyway, So this was put up in Paris, it was fine, and then the French decided, oh, we have this gallery in Alliance Française in Delhi, we should put it up there. And although when I shot it, I made sure there were no genitals showing, that it would be plausible to show it in India. And so when it opened, we also made sure that so it was a show with different projects. So the three in the front were, didn't have any naked bodies, so that's family fun, okay. And so this one it was hidden from view, it was blocked, you had to go around something, and you wouldn't notice saying you had to be 18 and that there was like a trigger warning, Anyway, so somebody who we later discovered was some very retired civil servant went in there and photographed what was on the walls and complained to the local police station, who turned up and started wanting to have pictures taken down. And the weird reason they gave me was that this was against Hindu culture. And so I thought it was funny at first because I thought it was odd that these are policemen in uniforms, not the plainclothes guys. But how the guys from the station get to define what Hindu culture, like I didn't suddenly think they had the expert knowledge of it. But it kind of escalated, unfortunately. There was a French person in charge of the space, he really panicked, and the more he panicked, the more heavy the police became. In the end, by the end of the opening, he had decided to not have the pictures on his premises, so they became a bit problematic as works. And then suddenly we were standing outside the venue with these pictures and trying to call our lawyer friends. Our lawyer friends tend to be people coming out of ALS and Bangalore, so we're calling them. And they were saying, obviously, there's no offense. I mean, there's no, you can't prove Hindu culture and what's against it legally. So what they probably do is make it obscene. What we do have is the Obscenity Act, and that's a criminal offense. That's quite serious, which means that they destroy the pictures. The pictures become, their existence became illegal. Making such pictures becomes illegal. You end up in court. And in my case, because I'm a foreign citizen, you put in the next plane out, you never come back. So it was potentially quite serious.
I mean, it's also sort of an argument that is being played out right now around same-sex marriage. That this is against Indian culture, this is against Hindu culture. If you decide to, I mean, this is what queer people are told all the time, right? You can exist, you form relationships, just don't ask for marriage. Just don't ask for inheritance rights, in a way. So we are fine with queer pictures where people's faces and bodies are hidden, but whether if their bare bodies without genitals also show with an intention to have desire, I mean, I'm not even going to say sex because people may or may not choose to have sex. Imagine if these pictures had women in them, you would have been locked up immediately, right? The male form is still tolerable.
Yeah, that's true. It's something that's peculiar to photography. Had this been sculpture, maybe something else might have happened. It's very particular to photography. Well, it's interesting you mentioned gay marriage. I got married, by the way. I got gay married. I mean,
And that was also a kind of position to take, wasn't it? It was political.
it was a difficult position to take because the group that I was part of, the ex-GNU, who suffer from a kind of radicalitis, were very against it, but they were against the idea of marriage. So they felt I was betraying the cause, so tried to talk us out of it. But we got married anyway. I will still speak to them.
Any questions that anybody has? Yeah, please.
Hello. Actually, 80s has been started. At that time, after Stonewall, the newspaper published in New York has been same bill. So when the 8 hits the gay community, like COVID, they have been mentioned the count and that this makes the newspaper to sell high in the New York City. So what happens is this makes the public view that gay community people is the main reason for getting all the AIDS and infection disease. So what happened? They got the mindset, these are the people for causing all this issue. But the back end of what happened is the newspaper has been sell high because they only covered only the gay community people, but the disease has been spread all over the country, actually different states and also. So what if recent also a few days back, National AIDS Control Organization in India has been released the data. Transmission of HIV in India, heterosexual is 83% and homosexual is just a 4%. Just I want to know means that publisher has been changed a lot of mindset that LGBT people are the reason for getting AIDS. So I want to know, does it change now? Because it happens in 80, then 2005, till 2005 you are there, actually in New York. So after that, is it changed? That LGBT people is not the only people for getting this issue. So I just want to know about that.
Okay, I'll unpack your question. So, what I experienced was that in the West, it was a gay plague, and in India, it was not the case. I once saw a map at NACO, from NACO, which is the National AIDS Control Body in India. And the map was basically of the trucking routes. And AIDS famously arrived in this country here in Chennai. I didn't get the sense living here that gays were being blamed for AIDS here as much as I got in the West. What I do get a sense of over here is that there's a huge amount of stigma. And the stigma is not only coming from straight people, it's coming from other gay people. So you try putting I'm HIV positive on your private profile and you see how many requests you get, So, so I find increasingly the LGBT, the queer thing is more and more open and it's a little bit acceptable. I think there's been a generation of workshops like this going on up and down the country. And it's kind of bearing some fruit. I don't think it's unusual for young people now to, for example, be fluid. I'm staying with some friends who run a school in Delhi, and they reported that one of the middle school students, which is like 10, 11, a girl, she came into school one day and decided she was trans. She was a boy. And he said, okay, then you'll be working. And she had already done this with the parents. The parents were in support. I think things are noticeably shifting around gender and queerness, but things are not shifting around HIV.
I think just to add to what Sunil is saying, we dropped the ball on HIV a while ago.
We dropped the ball on HIV a while ago, and this is also a problem for queer folks because earlier, the epidemic in India was always focused on a more heterosexual transmission. There was transmission among what they call gay men, MSM, and other partners also. But the largest burden was, now, unpacking that is a little difficult at times. because who was identifying as heterosexual and who was having casual sex with whom. In India, it is very amorphous, right? Men experiment with other men all through their early childhoods and or youth. And for what reason and where they get and so but their identity they think is heterosexual. So to that extent, the burden of a gay plague didn't fall on us. It didn't. We were lucky because the large set of, as NACO said, the largest set of cases were in. But Sunil is right because earlier we did a lot of work on HIV stigma reduction. We're doing nothing right now. And that's very sad because India still has a sizable burden of HIV affected, like close to 20 lakhs now, right? Or something like that. But we haven't done anything. We don't think we should do anything for them because budgets have dried up and things like that. Any other question? No?
So because you mentioned the parties earlier, so I had a question about that. So when talking about all the parties that were happening and that were being masqueraded and everything, these parties are always paid parties, right? So they're only accessible to a certain class and caste of men and women. So, what was it like for people who did not belong to these, who who were not included in these class and caste of men and women who had access to these parties? Like, what was their experience of being queer or being gay in 80s, 90s, and everything?
Well, I couldn't tell you that because I was one of the people who had the 500 rupees to go to the other party. But there's somebody here who can tell you if he wants to. If you're tired. Okay.
But I can add to that because I think there are two things to understand here.
I think there are two things to understand here. One, there were not too many paid parties in the 80s and 90s. They were more like somebody's house, everybody brought something. Sometimes friends of friends of friends of acquaintances landed up because there was no gay place to go to except the cruising areas. Second thing is, of course, these parties were exclusionary. I remember both of us going to many of them, people hanging outside, trying to figure out money. But the other important thing is that we often think that people who are getting excluded are not having a good time. That's not necessarily true. Because, no, I know, I just want to say that because a lot of the folks who are cruising in parks or doing things, they build their own communities. They have their own kind of, they pool resources and try and have a good time as well. The unfortunate part is that we have access to so few spaces that until we hire a place or we pay for it extensively, there aren't places for queer people to collect. So then these paid parties are the result. Sorry.
Yeah. So kind of inadvertently, the arrival of AIDS, in a limited way, created health education centers. We call them centers. And so these kind of popped up around HIV NGOs. There were several in various, at least metropolitan cities, probably elsewhere. And if you went to those, you would see a social network developing of an underclass that couldn't afford to go to the other parties. As I said before, there's this great social divide that we live in. I think I went to one such party, where they had an actual Nach Gana kind of thing happening. And, people kept, bouncing handbags off because it was so vigorous in their social behavior. There wasn't any of this polite, like, little bit of distance between you and me. So a different kind of social etiquette was being played out. So then it was my turn to feel uncomfortable. I didn't feel like I had enough personal space. And, people kept bashing into me. It was more like a discomfort rather than anything else. Then what happens is that we now have these distinctive groups, and language is another dividing factor. So we have the college educated, the bigger kind of groups, or perhaps your group, people in the big universities, who sometimes try and bridge the gap. So through Liga, we did try and bridge the gap. And through mutual friends, we might have an evening where people from both sides get together and have a kind of exchange, or try to come to some understanding. But what would happen is that the elite people go to the non-elite space and sit on the floor and act normal because we're all Indian and everybody sits on the floor. That's not an issue. The other way around is an issue. But those people can't come to your space. They wouldn't know how to behave. And then you would get pissed off. So it's a big issue. This is for you guys to take forward. This is your generational moment to do something.
Question?
Yes, so I think I also think there is a huge difference between villages and cities in India. Like I'm coming from a village. Like when I was in my village, I didn't know like after coming here, like I came to know that queer communities has a very rich culture in India. Like after listening to listening to the events Vannam for organized, I came to know there is a very rich culture that queer community has in India. And so, like when we compare this to villages, they don't have anything. Like I don't know like anything such thing has existed anywhere. So like, what do you think about like this? Nobody knows that queer community has a rich this kind of this much life in India.
I think that's very simple. That's because what's known as gay subcultures are very urban. They're an urban phenomena, and they happen in cities. It's just the way it is. They don't. So people tend to leave smaller communities where they come from, villages or small towns, and they gravitate to bigger and bigger places because that's where they find more and more of this gay subculture. This is the case everywhere. Also, I just come from my father's Indian village in UP, and obviously you can't have this kind of discussion there. They don't have the language for it. And so if I was a young gay person in that village, I would head for the nearest sizable town, which in that case might be Lucknow.
You want to have that?
Sir, there is always a fear factor when someone comes out as queer. Uh, Now, even if the government is totally antithetical to the queer people, but still there is no criminal prosecution for queer people. But at your times, when there was a fear of prosecution both by the state and society, so how is coming out different in the context of today and your times?
How is it different from your times?
I mean, when he was coming out, he can tell you about that. I can tell you about when I was coming out. How was it different from today coming out then? In India.
Oh, in India. Well, in India, yeah, there was you couldn't come out. There was no vocabulary. Nobody was speaking about it at all. You probably didn't know yourself what you were really, what the potential of what you might be. There was no such identity available to you as. So that way things have changed completely. We have discussions like this. Uh, and that's fine. And I guess crucially, the law changed. So some people tell me that when it was illegal, the parents would say that, well, I don't know I can't tell what's wrong with it, but it's criminal, so there must be something wrong with it. That's a discussion that's no longer possible. So sometimes you should kind of despair and just focus on the law, but I guess the law is important. We need it on your side. I mean, for example, the opposite happened in Uganda. You might have read it. I don't know, the version was not the death penalty. Barbaric. So, and I think also, being my age, you realize that laws are just laws. People make laws, and things can change, as we saw with the Section 377. 1 minute it was gone, then it was brought back. Who's to say they won't bring it back the next lot? Depends on who's in power. You kind of have to remain vigilant about what's happening.
I mean, I agree with that. In my time, it was relatively easier, but that's because my parents came from a certain background. But even today, we hear stories of young people who come out who are subjected to conversion therapy, who do expand, and there's all kind of family pressure. So it's coming out depends, and it's a myth that you come out in the West and it's easier. It's easier to escape to a New York or a London. But if you're stuck in Texas, you can be thrown out of a job because you came out as gay, and that's so-called developed country of the world. So I'm just trying to say to you that coming out is always a tricky decision. You have to be sure that you are safe. You are able to take care of your physical and mental health, and that you are in no position of imminent danger, that you have a backup plan. That's what I always say to people. Coming out is important, it's an important rite of passage, but self-care and the mental health that Sunil was talking about is more important, because you can come out a little bit later, but you have to be mentally in the same frame of mind. A lot is made out of families, but I do want to say families in India are wonderful institutions to grow and nurture in. But the moment you break the rules, you get punished very severely. And nobody can tell you that better than women and gay men. Because the moment women break the rules in families, everybody in the family and extended family punishes it. Talk about divorce, talk about being single, talk about not being happy with your husband, talk about disliking your uncles, and it is all your fault. Right? It's the same with gay men or lesbian women. The moment you break the rules beyond the point. So when you come out, you should also think about who are you coming out to. Are you coming out to yourself? Are you coming out to your family? Are you coming out to people around you? And do they understand? And how it will impact you. That's very critical according to me. Because in the end, it's about your self-preservation also.
Yeah, I think the generally accepted wisdom nowadays is that it's a very personal decision. That people can feel pressured in both ways, and that's not good for them either, or not good for their mental health. So really, it's up to each and everyone. It's a very personal choice that you make. My generation, we had this experience where the coming out became this huge social event, and there were all kinds of demonstrations. So it became important to basically show that gay people existed literally by being physically out in the public space, having parades, these things that have now become pride, originally a political act where people came out to exhibit themselves simply to be seen and to be counted.
Yeah, I remember one of the judges in 377 court case commenting to one of the lawyers that I don't see enough gay people in the courthouse. If you think this is such an important law, how come there are not enough gay people? So the next day she told me she rounded up 40 of her friends and brought them to the courthouse, and she said, here are 40 people. You please see them. They are all gay or lesbian or trans. You have a look. Can you give these 40 people their rights? So visibility is also very important as a political act, as a social act. And
So it needn't be you personally.
Yeah.
You let the others do it.
yeah. It doesn't always have to be. I mean, in our time, it was a little bit needed because you had to make that statement. And sometimes even to your family, you had to just say, no, I'm out now. What else?
With my mother, if I mentioned anything about sex, she would just cry. So, there was no discussion, she just went.
I think a lot of women in the audience can identify that with their mothers crying the moment they mention sex, because that's still continuing in many parts of India. I want to ask, because I think we started late and you guys are running out of time.
Yeah.
So I want to close with a question. I mean, is anybody have a question? No? So let me ask you this question, because you've been referring to mental health in a big way. Mental health, even though we've got these rights and we're talking about marriage, the mental health of queer people is only deteriorating on a daily basis. I sometimes feel like the amount of loneliness, the lack of self-care, sometimes the relationships with the self are so damaged. Um, and then, of course, even the queer community doesn't help. You know, no fact, no friend, no this, no that. You're tired of listening. It's like we are doing the same to ourselves that straight people were doing to us at one point in time. What is the way to maintain some of the, I mean, you've been through a lot of ups and downs in that sense. What is the way for a queer person to try and take care of themselves, think about good mental health? Because I think that's relevant to everyone here.
Well, I think the best way is to meet real people. Uh, and not rely entirely just on the apps. It's true what you say about this spreading anxiety and loneliness because of the apps and this menu-driven, choice-driven thing. And the whole caste and class and all that's playing a big, huge part, and no facts and no friends and whatnot. And it seems to me that one of the main driving forces of, well, certainly some kinds of mental health problems come from being unable to communicate with other people, either because you don't know many other people or you're kind of isolated from your family or the people that you live with. And it's important to go and then seek out like-minded souls. I spent my whole 20s, 30s periods, my social life was to go to meetings because I had to seek out meetings. I'd find people of queer people of some interest, and then maybe around gay issues. It needn't be, there's always nowadays there's a tendency for a queer version of any kind of major issue. So if you want climate change, or you're anti-nuclear, or if you want to save the forest, there will be a gay version of that, where you hang out, have a talk, and in that social environment, so instead of everyone running off now, if you hung out and had a drink or something, that would, in a way, give you a chance to meet other people. I mean, in a way, university provides that in the structure of it, but for people who've left, or people who haven't, well, I mean, people not in a institutional framework like this, it can be very isolated. The family may not know, the office may not know, so both the places where they're meeting people don't know that they're gay, and then they don't see any other gay people. And the only gay people they're seeing are people that they're sleeping with. who don't really uh, talk to you very much.
I mean, I think what you're referring to is finding a community and keeping it at all points, finding families.
So I think we've regressed that way. In a way, the old cruising grounds were creating a community. And so in a way, the people that we were talking about earlier, the kind of underclass, still have a community because they do, because of their financial situation and whatever, live in some kind of group or networked way more than we do.
Yeah, and this isolation is actually, it's like cancer for,
Capitalist.
yeah, and it's also cancer for queer people because you will be constantly told that you have the next thing to achieve, the better job, the better house, the better position, the better holiday, but actually all along your mental health is what is suffering. Because what you really need first is self-care and a functional relationship with yourself and your community, right? That that kind of has evaporated in today's queer space. While we've got all these rights, what we've lost is a sense of community in a way.
I think so, yeah. Because now it's so social media driven, which is such an intense space. And you know, people ghost you.
I also know that people have to pretend to be happy all the time. That is itself a burden. I keep seeing so many queer people making videos after videos. My heart is broken, it's on social media. My finger is broken, it's on social media. My cat is crying, it's on social media. I'm just like, but when are you living your life? Because the whole purpose of living in not on the central courtyard or let's say Gajendra Chowk is that you have privacy. We've gone to the other antithesis, right? We're saying we have no privacy. Even if I'm going to see a leaking pipe, I'm making a. I mean, just the other day I was coming from the airport in Chennai. There was a traffic jam, and a guy stopped his bike in the middle of the road to do what? Guess. Make a video. And I was just like, somebody can kick you off the flyover. What do you do? And he was saying, I must report this. I'm like, what are you? CNN? Like, what are you reporting? So it's sort of also something for queer people to watch out. Social media is liberating, but it's also a no-win game at some point. What do you think? I mean, you come from a generation who's no social media.
Yeah, no, it's. I found a lot of sustenance meeting real people, so I'm all for that.
So I think we're done. Thank you so much, Sunil, for that. We apologize for but these pictures I think are something everybody should see because they represent an arc of his work, but also a lot of our political and queer history traveling in various paths.
Yes, so that's the project to be undertaken in many different parts of India. I should teach at NID, and then one of our social projects was that because the students came from all over India, was to every time they went home, they would research local photo histories, and bring them back to Ahmedabad. So there'll be lesbian and gay histories right here. You need to go out and collate them.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for everyone for attending, and thank you so much for this. It was incredibly interesting. I loved all the pictures, and I loved your point of view as an Indian living in the US and the UK, and your